We all know, of course, the gravity of the situation that is confronting universities and our subject community as a whole. That has, I think, been brought home to everyone very starkly recently. So we're going to get straight down to business by discussing the report, The Languages Crisis, Arresting Decline. Our three speakers are Megan Bowler, who is a DPhil student in classics at the University of Oxford. She was the author of the 2020 report, A Languages Crisis, ? And is, of course, the author of the report we will be discussing today. Emma is chair, of course, of UCFL. Charles is the British Academy's lead for languages. So we're going to begin with a short summary of the report from Megan. We're going to talk for about 35 minutes, very much in conversation style, and then leave plenty of time for questions. So, Megan, would you like to begin with a short summary of your report?
Thank you so much. And it's really wonderful to see how many people are interested in this topic and have joined the meeting. So to give you some background to the Arresting Decline report, as Charles mentioned, I wrote a previous report for the Higher Education Policy Institute 5 years ago when I was an undergraduate intern. And this explored how languages in the UK are basically facing a very complex and long-term pattern of decline, and particularly since 2004, when languages ceased to be a compulsory GCSE subject. And HEPI then got back in touch with me 5 years later and suggested, sort of with the imminent curriculum and assessment review and all of this, that it would be a really good time to provide an update on the topic. So I just wanted to make the most of the opportunity, really, to try to compile and draw attention to the vast array of languages policy research that has emerged within this past sort of 5-year period, in a way that would be easily accessible for policymakers and stakeholders in this field. And it's been really good to see that the report precipitated further conversations about languages in the media over the summer, kind of news articles gathering further data and accounts as well about regional cold spots and languages provision and things like this. As you know, I'm something of an interloper because I'm an ancient linguist rather than a modern one. My academic research and teaching is in ancient Greek. So I was also keen to take up this opportunity to sort of promote some further dialogue between our two disciplines, classics and MFL, in collaborating on this important topic of language learning and sharing good examples of practice. And another aim of my report was to take stock of some of the changes that have happened during this very eventful time period. Of course, the impact of the pandemic, the effects of Brexit, and the rise of LLMs. So in the first section of the report, I try to use this as an opportunity to make the case for why language learning is not less important, but actually more important in the age of AI. And in practice, this meant trying to find ways to articulate the value of language learning when its benefits might not be obvious to everyone. So I refer to this as the linguistic mindset. And the concept was especially inspired by thinking about successful interventions that have encouraged students to become more enthusiastic about languages at an early stage, before they make GCSE choices and things like this. So, for example, the Queen's College Translation Exchange, which helps students to think like a linguist, and the World of Languages, Languages of the World, WALLO curriculum, in which students are encouraged to draw connections between different languages and recognise the transferability of languages spoken at home. So framing the value of languages in terms of a mindset struck me as quite a useful way of addressing misconceptions, improving kind of public awareness about language. So highlighting that you can access educational benefits just from engaging and participating, not only from reaching perfect fluency in one language, and acknowledging a better sort of spectrum approach of language knowledge. And basically trying to get away from the misconception that languages only matter if you go on to use them in your daily life. So this approach is also a way of celebrating, I guess, the value and transferability of all kinds of language learning. And in the report, I identified 13 reasons, I think it was, that why the linguistic mindset equips learners well for this age of technological change. So things like close critical analysis, cultural adaptability, creative problem solving, linguistic precision, communication, and empathy towards new perspectives. And the second aspect of the research was, slightly more doom and gloom, and it was to track the data on the uptake of languages in school qualifications and in higher education. So at GCSE, of course, the languages trends surveys continue to highlight disparities not only between independent and state schools, but also between affluent and more disadvantaged regions. And the narrowness of then the Key Stage 5 curriculum means that very few students are able to continue with languages education. So only, I think it was less than 3%, yet 2.97% of A-levels taken in 2024 were for modern languages, classical languages, Welsh second language, and Irish combined. So that's a very low level of opportunity to participate at that level. And I suppose if we are to speak of the language crisis, this slightly complex label, it is primarily a crisis of unequal and variable opportunity. We see disparities emerging between schools in which language is a core subject versus optional. Harsh grading, of course, contributes further to this incentive problem that we see, whereby schools and students are discouraged from pursuing language qualifications. And this extends as well to the under-recognition of pupils' existing multilingualism. So basically what we're seeing now are vicious cycles, challenges with teacher recruitment and retention then lead to even scarce opportunities for participation in language learning in schools. And then this low participation in school qualifications leads to lower uptake of languages in higher education. And of course, this sort of perceived low demand from students then is used to sort of justify cuts to degree programs, institution-wide language provision, and even department closures, as unfortunately we're seeing now. And of course, this shortage of graduates with language skills is then a disadvantage for all kinds of sectors in society, trade, tourism, diplomacy, the creative industries, and many more, as well as, of course, the teacher recruitment problem. So what are the recommendations that the report makes? I think in the short term, of course, improving teacher recruitment and retention has to be a priority. So language teacher recruitment, as we know, falls very significantly below government targets every year. And we should really be trying to ease the pathway for international language teachers. Addressing harsh marking of modern languages exams relative to other subjects is, of course, necessary, but equally building the interest in language and the linguistic mindset has to begin earlier. I also believe that introducing alternative qualification pathways would offer a greater variety of opportunities for participation, and this was a topic that actually came up in the government's response to the CAR. For instance, qualifications which might be better suited to heritage learners, like the former ACIT languages scheme, and vocational options such as incorporating applied languages certification into the new V-level system, with an emphasis on communication and intercultural skills. We also need improved regional and national coordination, enabling state schools to benefit from the staff and resources of the independent sector, linking schools with community language schools, creating better connections between teachers, academics, and policymakers, as initiatives like the Languages Gateway aims to do. Turning to higher education, then, it's becoming increasingly clear to me in light of these sort of financial pressures facing the sector and our discipline in general, it's not enough simply to ask institutions not to close programs and departments that are struggling with demand. And we urgently need national oversight and targeted investment to protect high-level linguistic training and expertise in this country, particularly in the case of small but strategically important subjects, to maintain the availability of language provision for students in all subjects, and to protect and expand the outreach and mentoring schemes that higher education departments contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. That was a model of clarity of the situation we find ourselves in. There are 10 recommendations in the report, as Megan said, and I'd like to begin the conversation by asking Emma and Charles just to comment on what they think, about the report more generally, its traction, its resonance, its importance, and to pick out one or two of the recommendations that they find most important. They're all important, but so Emma, perhaps you'd like to
kick off. Okay, well, thanks very much, Charles, and thanks, Megan, as well for your fantastic report. Just in terms of University Council for Languages, which I represent as chair, I just wanted to say how much we welcome the release of the report. I think, as you said yourself, it's really kind of focused minds on this issue again, which is really, really valuable. In terms of the recommendations, I'll probably just deal with the ones relating to higher education, which UCFL, highly endorses. So for those of you who have the report in front of you, or who might perhaps get a copy of it later, the first one I'd like to pick out is number 6. So, as Megan said, making languages a priority in higher education, and as those of us who work in higher education know, it doesn't always seem that that's the case at the moment. Megan, you talked about unequal opportunity. Clearly, some of the closures that we're seeing now, the restructuring and so on, is being done in a sense independently by individual institutions without that kind of oversight that you call for in your report, which then leads to these what have been termed cold spots by Becky Moradas-Taylor. And most of you, I think, will be aware of the fantastic work the British Academy's done on mapping cold spots across the country. In particular, right now, many of you will be aware of the situation facing colleagues at Nottingham, University of Nottingham and University of Leicester, among others. Obviously, the closure of both of those sets of programs and closure of those departments would create a large cold spot across the East Midlands, where students just wouldn't have access to degrees in languages. So I think that for me is a kind of real standout recommendation to make it a priority for senior leaders to give priority to not necessarily priority, but at least equal weight to languages in their curricula. I mean, some of the issues, of course, are the fact that languages at degree level are very resource heavy to deliver. SSRs, which are much cited in management documentation, tend to be lower. We tend to need more staff to deliver our programs because of the wide the breadth, the range of languages that we need to offer to attract students. I suppose the other thing I'd mention is single honours versus joint honours. The report mentions strengthening provision through joint provision with other departments. Obviously, in a lot of places, that's just not possible at the moment to offer. Quite often, that's the first thing that gets cut. And we know that single honours is declining in languages, so we really do need that joint honours provision to be open. I think that's probably all I want to say on that for the moment. I mean, again, improving the oversight of languages in higher education is crucial in order to, I suppose, take account of the what I was saying about the cold spots, the unequal opportunity. Quite who's going to do that, I don't know, but somebody needs to come forward to do that, perhaps through collaboration between institutions, either regionally or nationally. Charles, Charles Forsdick, did you want to perhaps come in there as well?
Very happy to. Charles, thanks for convening this. Megan, thank you for the report. I'm going to say a little bit about the context of the report in a moment, but extremely welcome intervention. And Emma, it's always good to speak on a panel with you and to hear about your experience, both through UCFL, but also running a large language school at Leeds. Megan, we really, across the languages community, really welcome this intervention. I think it's extremely timely. It's 5 years on since your initial report, A Language Crisis with that question mark. It's also 5 years since the British Academy, the HRC, British Council, Universities UK, and the Association of School and College Leaders produced the document Towards a National Languages Strategy. And I think we're at a useful point to pause and to reflect on your initial report, the effectiveness of this strategy, and crucially, and I think this picks up on some of your final comments, Megan, the need actually to move towards a national languages strategy, which takes into account all 4 nations of the UK, our specificities, but also our common needs and purposes. The other reason I thought that the timing was extremely helpful, and this is within an English context, was that the report fell at a time when there were lots of discussions in the context of the Curriculum and Assessment Review, attempting to ensure that languages were at the forefront of that review. We might say a little bit more of the outcome in a moment. Important to remember also that there's a curriculum review ongoing in Scotland. And clearly, Emma's alluded to this already, thinking about colleagues in Leicester and Nottingham and very much sending solidarity to them. We're in a context, again, of a contracting modern languages curriculum in higher education, which is symptomatic of much broader systemic challenges in university funding and governance, in which the impact on modern languages is, I would argue, disproportionate. So the report came at a really key time. Megan, if I could challenge one thing, though, you are not at all an interloper. I think what's really exciting over the past 5 or 10 years is that increasingly across languages, we are thinking together and we are speaking with a common cause, whether we are from ancient languages or modern languages, European languages or non-European languages, global languages or minoritized languages or spoken language or signed languages. And I think I think your intervention, your authorship reflects that. Just a couple of comments on the report, Charles, in response to your question. One aspect I really welcome is your careful and thoughtful codification there of a linguistic mindset. And you've set us a range of principles there on which we can expand. I was very pleased to hear you mentioning the work that Charlotte Ryland has been leading around Think Like a Linguist in Rochdale and in Blackpool and in other places in the UK. I think what you're outlining there is not only a sense of skills in languages, which unfortunately have been omitted from recent government documents like the Skills White Paper, and we need to push very much on that. And I think you provide us with good material to think that through, but also that sense of a disciplinary DNA in terms of what we do in the languages disciplines, and crucially thinking about that complementary relationship in universities between language centres and between language departments, in which we remain committed to the integrated study of language and culture. So first of all, very much welcome your provocations and resourcing of the community around linguistic mindset. In terms of recommendations, if I could just mention 3, and I think they're all interlinked. I very much appreciated your comments on languages and social inequality, particularly in the context of the current government's mission of breaking down barriers to opportunity. I think we really need to highlight the risks of concentration, thinking at secondary school in particular, the concentration of language learning in grammar schools and in independent schools. We also need to focus on something that Emma mentioned, and that's the risk of concentrating language degrees in higher tariff institutions. And that's where the work of Becky Moradas-Taylor and others is so useful. So first point is around languages and social inequality, social justice indeed. I think linked to that, Megan, is your point about enhancing recognition of multilingualism. Particularly that idea that starting at primary level in the languages classroom, and indeed across the curriculum, if we talk about language-friendly schools, which I think we ought to, meeting pupils where they are in terms of their repertoire of languages. I think that's a shift from where perhaps traditionally we've been in modern languages, but it really highlights that missed opportunity that we've seen for a number of years now of seeing the multilingual classroom as a problem, even a space to be pathologized, which is rather alarming, as a resource. And I think that links in to the third point I wanted to mention, which is your recommendation around alternative qualifications and pathways. Whereas in terms of the multilingual classroom, I think that the curriculum assessment review didn't really pick up the challenge there, and we might come back to that later. One positive aspect, I think very positive aspect of the Department for Education response to the curriculum assessment review is that commitment to revisit models of alternative qualifications, possibly going back to the languages ladder, which we saw developed under the last Labour government, but crucially associated qualifications like the asset languages. And I think that raises all sorts of options about recognition of a broader range of languages, keeping language learners involved in language learning in a way that is not the case now. It's going to require some adjustments, not least for us at university in terms of our curricula, in terms of our entry expectations, but perhaps we'll come back to that in a moment.
Thank you. Perhaps we could just touch, I mean, we might well organise another meeting in this forum to talk about the implications of the curriculum and assessment review. But perhaps we can spend a few minutes on that, and also the question of teacher recruitment. Can I ask Megan what your, after the report, after the traction it had, after the presentation to the APPG, after all the work that has been done to really stress the importance of language in the curriculum and assessment review, can you perhaps reflect for a couple of minutes on the CAR and the question about teacher recruitment? I'll then ask Charles to come back on that, because I know that's something that he's been working very extensively on.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Yeah, and thanks, Emma and Charles, also for your really interesting and insightful comments as well on the report. Yeah, in terms of the CAR, I think I share a lot of the concerns that have been expressed by linguists in the media. Again, this is a really good thing that we're doing this and we're talking about it in a very public way about the impact of the CAR on the challenges facing languages. The issue of potentially further discouraging GCSE uptake with the loss of sort of the EBAC system. The risk of potentially narrowing the scope of languages education at Key Stage 2, the issue of multilingualism not being adequately dealt with. Also, the fact that we spoke about the national languages strategy and all of the progress that has been made in sort of bringing together all types of languages, ancient, modern, heritage, signed, all of this into sort of into language as a whole. And I think that was also lacking from the CAR. I think, as Charles mentions, there's a much more positive note, I think, was the government's responding, kind of pledge to explore the feasibility of developing a new qualification for languages that enables pupils to have their achievements acknowledged when they are ready rather than at fixed points, and which would recognise achievements as well earlier than GCSE. I think this seems like a very interesting and positive step to, kind of recognising achievements, motivating continued study, offering a defined sense of progress, which is currently lacking. And I think this resonates a lot with my recommendations about, the alternative qualification pathways. I think, there's a lot to say that the government doesn't need to start from scratch here. The idea of this sort of former asset languages assessment scheme, the languages ladder framework, all very sensible places to sort of start and to find kind of places to build on. But I think, perhaps this is somewhere where, languages associations and our subject community can play quite an active role in trying to hold the government to account on this, to sort of say, can we have an update? Where's this exploration, please? And to sort of monitor the progress on this, because I think this is a really, really positive step if this were to happen. In terms of teacher recruitment, I think it's clear that this is quite a widespread problem. It's affecting other sectors as well as languages. So I think in terms of, how do we tackle this, perhaps collaborating with other subject disciplines on this issue, as well as more generally to sort of highlight, that this is a shared issue of something that's been affected by Brexit, and it's sort of getting worse with this ethos towards immigration that we're seeing. And I think obviously, trying to convince the government to ease the pathway for immigration is not easy, but I think trying to make a case for attracting languages teachers from abroad, such as reinstating incentives, I think would be a very important thing. I think also, when we talk about recruitment, it's not only recruitment, but also retention that's an issue here. And also the ability of having, opportunities to retrain existing teachers to deliver languages provision. I think that's something that we have seen done quite successfully with ancient languages, for example.
Thank you, Megan. Charles, can you add to Megan's reflections?
Very happy to, and some of my comments will echo with Megan's very useful insights there. I think we've got to be clear that there was the outcome of the CAR process and the report there, and I've commented publicly on that, particularly about the implications of the withdrawal of EBAC for languages. And we could have a debate about that. EBAC was, as an incentivization measure, it didn't deliver the intentions, which were 90% of pupils to achieve the EBAC, which would have meant 90% of pupils at Key Stage 4 taking a language GCSE, where we never really got higher than the top 40s. I think the anxiety now is that even though it didn't deliver, it still remained a useful incentivization measure, particularly for school leaders, to ensure that languages were retained in the post-14 curriculum. So there are concerns there, which I understand need to be counterbalanced with the commitment to a broad and balanced curriculum, particularly one containing creative subjects. So I think that's one debate. The crucial issue here, and Megan's alluded to it though, is the Department for Education response to the Carr report, where I think there is considerable room for us as a subject community to engage. Not least in terms of ensuring that what's being outlined there is delivered, but crucially making sure that these discussions are very evident in our departments, and that where possible we resource the DfE and others to deliver what they would like to see. There's a quite a technical issue here about replacing EBAT with what's called Progress 8 as a measure of curriculum diversity, and I think there will be a consultation around that, and I think we need to push as a community to ensure that language is as visible as possible in that measure. Megan's already mentioned some of the key issues here. Key Stage 2, all we've been told so far is that there will be almost a retrospective fitting of developments at the new GCSE spec at Key Stage 2, particularly in providing vocabulary lists for primary pupils. A number of us would have reservations about that if that's all that happens. I think what's crucial, and this picks up on some of the comments in the chat, I think that at Key Stage 2, when pupils are curious and lack inhibitions and are happy to play with language, that is a space where we can also encourage the development of more metalinguistic knowledge and intercultural awareness alongside the acquisition of a single language. So I think that there is some work to be done in terms of fleshing out the Key Stage 2 proposals. What's promising, though, is that the Department of Education are clearly committed to resolving long-standing problems at Key Stage 2, but also in terms of transition between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, that primary to secondary transition. They're talking about adopting the Hackney model, which would at best mean closer conversations between primary schools, the feeder primary schools and local secondary schools, and that would disrupt less the language learning experience for pupils. Really keen to see the recommendations around alternative qualifications, to which I've already alluded, to see those developed further. And there are three areas mentioned more aspirationally, really, in the Department for Education document, but I think they would chime with what interests many of us around the scheme. One of them is to support a broader campaign of advocacy for languages. My view would always be that an advocacy campaign is all very well, but it needs to be complemented by policy innovation, not least top-down policy, but often top-down policy which is meeting bottom-up initiatives as well. But I think we should welcome that, and I would hope that will converge with work we're already doing within our community through vehicles like the Languages Gateway. There is a commitment by the DfE to think about the languages pipeline. And again, I think that's a crucial aspect for those of us at the higher education end, thinking about how language learners are given opportunities across the educational life cycle to develop their skills, to develop their interests, so that they can pick them up at degree level in various ways and through various programs. So I hope that we will be able to engage with that discussion around the pipeline, and also maybe the diversification of that pipeline to include a broader range of languages, not least home heritage and community languages, but to think beyond universities as well, and to something Megan mentioned in the report, which is lifelong learning, and ensuring that there are those opportunities for language learning beyond and outside formal education. And at the same time, there is a commitment to thinking about technologies within the delivery of language learning. I hope in a way that will go beyond, if I may say, the rather glib reference in the white paper on skills to the use of AI as a means of replicating conversation pairs for language learners. I think there's a lot more to be said there. And I think we as a community need really to push that, because in terms of some of the, particularly for protecting and even growing provision in lesser taught languages, it's clear that collaborative arrangements, which are blended with the use of new technologies, could allow us to build opportunities in a broader range of languages. So in terms of the curriculum assessment review, I think we need to see this as a space where there are genuinely opportunities for us as a community. Charles, very briefly, the curriculum assessment review did not address initial teacher education. Crucially, though, if we're to be in any way ambitious in this area, along the lines that we've already mentioned, there clearly need to be a sufficient number of teachers, language teachers, to deliver that. Those of us who go into schools on a regular basis know that we have a dedicated, creative, remarkably skilled group of language teachers in secondary schools and also in primary schools, where there are fewer specialists, but there is still there are high levels of commitment. It's not though just recruitment; it's retention as well. And I think whenever we talk about initial teacher education recruitment, we need to think about parallel measures to ensure that teachers are staying in schools. Three things very briefly. One of them mentioned by Megan already. I think as those of us in modern languages departments need to work much more closely with colleagues, and there are a number around the screen, in education departments. We need to pool resources. We need to declare common cause. At the same time, we need to encourage the government to retain bursaries. They retain them, but the level's been slightly reduced this year. But we need, again, a cross-departmental matching up between the DfE and the Home Office of bursaries and visas. We're hearing again and again about EU teachers who come and train here, receive a bursary, and then schools will not sponsor them for their visas. It's a system where the crucial parts are not talking to each other, and I think this then comes back to an issue for us again in higher education. I think we have a responsibility to not just make it clear to our students, and I would say our most talented and strongest students, that teaching modern languages is a fulfilling and important career pathway. We also have to think about creative ways of ensuring that we can integrate some exposure to experience of working in a classroom within our curricula. So I think, again, Charles, in terms of initial teacher education, I would very much welcome the Institute devoting a specific session to these issues and bringing in some of those specialists and experts who can speak much more knowledgeably about this than I can.
Thank you, Charles. Our next session will in fact be on languages for all, and we can certainly develop more seminars along that kind. It's crucially important, as you say. If we were to, let's move on slightly from all of this discussion. Well, everything is integrated. But one of the things that Megan does say is, how do you combat, or she speaks about, a widespread and deeply held misconceptions surrounding languages? And the question is, for all of us, how does one attempt to address those misconceptions about languages generally and about our subject community? So, Emma, perhaps you could reflect on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that we're all aware of, that we come across. I suppose most obviously in the media. There's a huge amount of quite negative media rhetoric, but also public rhetoric out there about languages. So I think again, Megan, your excellent articulation of the development of a linguistic mindset is really important there. And since we've talked a little bit about AI and technology, I think thinking about how to myth bust. But I think we're often coming up against those sort of comments below the line. Why would we bother studying languages when tools can do that for us. You know, and I think one of the things I really sort of took away from your report was the part where you talk about language learning not just as a process of converting one language to another, in a kind of you know, as a sort of a separate process. You know, that it needs to be kind of embedded in a deep understanding. You know, the thoroughgoing study of culture, which is obviously what we try to do at degree level. The other thing I quite enjoyed was the aside about calculators. You know, so having calculators doesn't necessarily mean we can stop teaching maths, or, you know, it doesn't obviate the need to have a mathematical mindset. And I think, you know, the linguistic mindset is something very similar. You know, just because we have AI and we have these tools does not mean that we don't need to, and we shouldn't learn languages. So that was something that I appreciated. I think one headline that I remember recently was at the Times Higher about AI. You know, is AI the final nail in the coffin for modern languages? That was a stonker of a headline. So, you know, these things are kind of in the public consciousness, and I think it's really important to sort of develop maybe even something like a toolkit where we could provide our community with the tools they need to sort of bust these myths where they come across them. And then obviously the other obvious one of everybody speaking English. And again, in your report, Megan, you highlight how I think it's 1 in 5 school-age children in the UK speak a home language that's different from English. So just kind of raising that awareness again, as I think, Charles, you were saying earlier, of the multilingual context that we already exist in the UK. So I think we've talked about, haven't we, maybe putting together some kind of a toolkit on our respective websites, possibly as part of the Languages Gateway, which has been mentioned before, the British Academy sponsored, well, not just British Academy, the initiative that came out, didn't it, Charles, from the Towards a National Languages Strategy paper, which is currently being run, or the editorial board being run by Charlotte Ryland, who's been mentioned earlier. So those are just some thoughts from me on that topic.
Thank you, Emma. Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, unless there is something of a national sea change in the way that we think about languages, multilingualism, and the purpose and relevance of languages and cultures and languages to core, then we're not going to be in a better situation. What is clear from the car is that things are not rapidly going to get better. They may even, in the short term, get worse. So, Megan, I've quoted you this phrase: how does one encourage an engagement or change of some of the misconceptions around languages and languages education?
Yeah, I think, my concern is that it's sort of widely known in circles of linguists, in academic circles, among teachers as well, who do tremendous work, that, you know, languages are, you know, it's not just this sort of useless process of trying to regurgitate information, or, you know, that languages are only useful if you attain some impossible standard of fluency. You know, all of these misconceptions are sort of, you know, we've already done a lot to combat them. But I think my concern is that, you know, these misconceptions are still persisting among wider society. You know, that this sort of misunderstanding also of what not only languages in schools look like, but what a languages degree, what languages research actually look like. And I think it also taps into the issue of linguophobia, the idea of intolerance towards other languages being spoken. The YouGov survey, for example, that I think it was like, what was it, sort of a very high percentage of British people felt bothered when hearing other languages spoken. I think it was, very, very high. So I think it's sort of, of course, you know, education in schools, I think, plays a very important role here in creating, I guess, a positive experience of languages that shapes perceptions of languages in later life. You know, this includes integrating things like creative translation, intercultural skills, linguistics, making the interconnections between languages. I think these things have been shown to sort of build enthusiasm for languages as a subject, these creative aspects. I think that's something that's very important. And I think also sort of tying in with things that the CAR has mentioned as priorities, things like oracy, these buzzwords. Modern languages and ancient languages do oracy very well. We are communication-based subjects. I think we need to sort of frame ourselves in these terms that I suppose are gaining traction, in order to sort of highlight the value and relevance of the subject. I think another part of this is, of course, making connections with the idea of languages and community cohesion, the role that languages, bringing in sort of the multilingualism of students, which, as we know, is very high. The languages they speak at home should be celebrated and seen as very transferable to languages that they learn at school. This kind of creative aspect in bridging different languages, highlighting the transferability of these skills and the connectedness of languages. And of course, universities also can play an aspect here, I guess, in sort of initiating campaigns, things like the City of Languages that we've just seen in Leeds, trying to raise this public awareness of languages, outreach initiatives, mentoring schemes. I think these are all ways of sort of highlighting also the value that higher education contributes to sort of solving these issues. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I should add at this point. I think also I think it's clear that using the media, using also social media to sort of raise awareness of these issues has to be something that's really important, because I think my concern is that the discourse is limited to sort of academic circles, perhaps.
Thank you, Megan. Charles, the British Academy, other bodies have certainly argued strongly that there should be national oversight of the languages infrastructure. That hasn't happened. It's unlikely to happen. So in the light of that, where should we be going with encouraging myth busting and wider consciousness of the importance for every aspect of the communities that we live in for language study?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. I think in terms of a centralized approach, and as I said at the beginning, we've got to be very, very careful to acknowledge the four nations of the UK and the way in which these debates are playing themselves out in different ways according to different contexts, and there's actually quite a lot of learning, I think, from each other. But the area that particularly worries me, and this picks up on some of the comments in the chat, and I see Hilary put it, has made a very important point there about the urgency of the challenge. Even if we can resolve issues at Key Stage 2, even if, and there are some very useful reflections in the chat there about how the linguistic mindset through the maybe what one might call a multilingual awareness is nurtured amongst primary school pupils towards the end of their primary experience. That will only begin to pay dividends for universities in 10 years' time, by which moment, as you've suggested, Charles, it might be too late. So I think the call for a national languages strategy will precisely allow us to join up sectors, but it will address the key issues that we're witnessing again and again in higher education, around the downside of institutional autonomy. That means that individual university executives and their governors can decide to withdraw complete subject areas. Languages we know are suffering from this disproportionately, on the grounds of short-term finances, or based on data which often requires much further scrutiny. And I think, picking up on Emma's comments on cold spots, and the British Academy have done excellent work on subject mapping in recent years. Some sort of more robust regulation, which looks at universities' decisions about withdrawal, not of programs, but from complete subject areas, which is what we're seeing, which is the threat we are seeing in the East Midlands at the moment. There needs to be a much clearer oversight and regulation of that for us to avoid an acceleration of the current trends. We've got some very positive initiatives at the moment. A number of people have mentioned the Languages Gateway, which is providing us with a forum that can be used for messaging and advocacy. I'm really pleased that Megan mentioned Cities of Languages as well. Initiative which the British Council is encouraging very actively, which allows us within civic spaces to think across education institutions, including complementary schools and home heritage community language speakers, employers, cultural organizations, to bring together a space where the importance of languages can be reinforced. A couple of points, Charles, because I know we need to get on to opening up the discussion. One real challenge that I think has been reflected in our discussion today, and some of you will have been involved in these reflections beyond this meeting, is the way in which we need to resource each other when we're faced with repeated misrepresentations, whether it's in the press, whether it's from university senior managers, whether it's unfortunately from parents and pupils who come to our university open days. There's a set of issues here. One is to do with the monolingual myth, and the fact that we need to be clear advocates of an acknowledgement that the UK is, crucially always has been, a multilingual nation, and that multilingualism is a resource, both culturally and economically and socially. Linked in with that is the sense of, and it's another monolingual myth, it's the global English, that English is enough. And we hear it again and again, and it manifests itself in a sort of Anglo-parochialism, which squeezes the teaching of other languages off our university campuses and out of other educational institutions. English is not enough. We have very clear statistics about the number of speakers of English globally, which actually is very low. We obviously get into questions of language and power then, but I think we need to challenge actively that idea of the all-pervasive nature of global English. Other colleagues have mentioned AI, ongoing discussion there, where I think we really need to look for some sectoral coherence around the way in which AI as a tool does not evacuate the need for human agency in language learning and in translation and interpreting. It does not evacuate the need for creativity. I see Vincent Everett's mentioned the question of severe grading in the chat, really important. And that compounds perceived difficulty. We make things even more difficult by severe grading at GCSE and A-level. A number of us are. It's a slow process, but we're engaging with the relevant bodies around that. And one of the things I really like about asset languages is it's based on a can-do approach, and it celebrates what pupils achieve as opposed to punitively criticizing for what they cannot do. The final aspect, Charles, I think, then I will stop, is getting away from education and skills. I think our focus is quite rightly on language education and skills. It's on personal benefits, which many of us around the screen know all about. But it's also about those broader social benefits, which mean that we need to think about languages in the current context with the Labour government across its 5 missions and beyond. In each of those areas, security, trade, social cohesion, we need to be pushing for language-sensitive approaches and language-sensitive policies. Now, a lot of this is to do with a common set of messages, but that's not enough. And we can rise to the challenge, because I think the challenge is a translational one. We have a common set of messages, but we need to know how we can communicate those to the multiple audiences with whom we need to engage. And when you start thinking about those audiences, it really can be quite overwhelming. So pupils, their parents, school leaders and governors, careers teachers, university leaders, policymakers. We need to separate policymakers, many of whom listen very carefully to what we say, to politicians. And then there's that idea of a broader public understanding and getting across that idea of a linguistic mindset. But I think if we can continue to work on those core messages, particularly around some of the areas we've mentioned, and that challenging of the myths that are so often circulated, stabilize those, but then think about how we're going to translate those in ways that can hit those multiple audiences. I think that's a key part of addressing quite urgently the common challenge. And I think, just to give reassurance, that a number of us are doing that work already. The Languages Gateway is part of that. Those of us considering the benefits of a national languages policy are doing that, and we really need to harness as much energy and enthusiasm and as much expertise as we can to be able to deliver these projects.
Thank you, Charles. That's a very strong call for collaboration, greater collaboration. It exists, as you say, very strongly, but it needs to be stronger as the environment becomes more challenging. We have a good 25 minutes for questions, for people to voice issues that they've raised in the chat, and to take some of the issues that we've talked about today further. So please do come in. Yeah, you're muted, Ma. Sorry. Yeah, Charlotte, please come in.
Hello. Thank you very much for that absolutely fascinating discussion. I've changed my mind about 5 times about what I want to say. I'll try to keep it brief, but I've got a couple of points that are trying to make things very concrete. So firstly, on all the conversation around advocacy, myth busting, dealing with repeated misrepresentation, I think that really is one of the central issues that we're dealing with. I really, really like, for obvious reasons, Megan's focus on the linguistic mindset. That's what we've been talking about for a long time at the Translation Exchange especially. And I think what it does is it goes further than myth busting, which I think is something that we need to think about, because myth busting sounds like we're just waiting for the myths to develop and then we're kind of smashing them down, when in fact I think we need to really work together to develop a positive narrative that, takes account of those myths that we know are there, but that that presents a much more kind of constructive, positive response to all of this. And I think this relates to what Charles Forsdick was saying about breaking down barriers to opportunity, about the government mission and how relevant we know languages is to that. And then what Emma was saying about the need for languages to be prioritized in higher education. My feeling about both of those things is we know that, but how do we persuade the decision makers in policy and in higher education that languages is so relevant for those two issues? We know that government doesn't seem to, because, as Charles was saying, all of the white papers ignore languages almost completely, or make really kind of facile references to AI. And so I do think that before anything else, we really have to get together and to build this positive message, which is much stronger than, just focusing on skills or any one element of being a linguist, but that really leans into the linguistic mindset idea. And concretely, there's been lots of mentions of the Languages Gateway. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm chair of the editorial group of the Languages Gateway, and also I lead the Translation Exchange at the Queen's College and a charity called the Stephen Spender Trust, and they're all about raising the profile of languages nationally. So on the Languages Gateway side of things, we have taken on board suggestions that have come in previously about this idea of a toolkit for advocacy, and we're working on that at the moment, initially just in German. So we have a little bit of funding to do a pilot project to get HE departments, to get university German departments to collaborate on outreach and advocacy, to share learning, to share good practice, and for all of that to be collected together on the Languages Gateway website. If you're interested in hearing more, I'll pop my address into the chat. But the idea is that we learn from what works with German and then roll it out to other languages. And funding is going to be really essential for that. So any opportunities that you have for seeking funding for the Languages Gateway will be very helpful. And then the second thing I wanted to mention was lots of what was said about multilingualism at primary school. I also firmly believe that is the answer. That we need to really focus on the assets of the languages that young people, that at least 20% of young people speak across the country. And I think it's really important that we learn from existing good practice in that. I still feel like that good practice isn't really cutting through, especially to the HE sector. Megan mentioned WOLO, World of Languages, Languages of the World, which is a brilliant project. The Stephen Spender Trust also, that is our focus. Our focus is all about giving young people the opportunity to develop and celebrate their full linguistic repertoire. And we had an event this week where we had 17 languages in the room, all under 18-year-olds, on our prize, which has had over 235 schools taking part. And one of the things that we're working on at the moment is building up partnerships with universities, so that we can support universities to do this sort of to partner, so that we can translate modern languages research into community action. So I will pop my email into the chat, and if anybody would like to hear any more about that, then please get in touch. Thanks.
Thank you, Charlotte. What I think I'm going to do is just ask if there are any other questions, and then possibly ask our speakers to come back on the points that people have raised. These are fundamentally important. I think a question there is, we do need to think about some of the structures according to which we operate, whether we should try to bring subject associations more closely together, how we use resources that are available through subject associations and others, and how we all find it easy to lean into these initiatives. Other points that people would like to raise before asking our speakers to return to some of the crucial points that Charlotte has made.
Can I try again?
Well, yeah, please do.
It's just that although ideally we'd like most of the students at university learning languages to go out into the schools and teach the students very well, I think it's also important that they know there are other careers out there. For example, and I think this is part of AI as well. You can be a liaison interpreter, for example. And I know when I was a departmental figurehead for bringing in people to talk to our students about that they were short in Europe of translators from French to English. So I think these are all things that could be considered, that there are other careers out there. And I'm thinking particularly of the new translation in which Adam Watt's involved in À la Recherche. 2 volumes, perhaps 3 on the way so far. So there's always translation as well of books. Of course, you have to be very good for that, but a lot of people, there are some very good students out there. So there are other things you can do.
Thank you very much for that. The question of employability and foregrounding that, how we do that in individual institutes across the board, how we think about qualifications, and how we embed that in the messages that we collectively convey. There's a question that follows on from that. I'm afraid I can't keep up entirely with the chat, but there is a question on working with businesses more integrally than perhaps we do at the moment. Any other points people want to make before we get back to our speakers?
If we're all trying to come together and teach in a similar way, do we all need then to use the same textbook or produce new and better textbooks?
Well, I think a question of an awareness of the array of resources that are out there and a greater connection between, as
Yeah.
Charlotte was saying, research production and the way that it feeds through the education system as a whole and is enriched by that, and indeed the way in which it has other societal outlets is key. Natalie.
Yes, hi, Natalie here, and I work in Bangor University. I'm just wanting to just say just now, as I was just putting my hand up, that there has been a comment about the Welsh curriculum. And I stress here that there needs to probably be collaborations between the four nations, as you mentioned, Charles, because we are not at the same par, each one of us, in education terms, in language teaching. That's point number one. And we need to collaborate more, because specifically talking about the Welsh curriculum, we probably are a bit different in the way of the Welsh curriculum at the moment that has actually acknowledged the importance of international languages. And that's what we call them right now because of the multilingualism in Wales. And that is to bring down the curriculum to Key Stage 2 in terms of cultural and teaching the language. But that, of course, comes with its own challenges because you have to equip, although we've got expert and excellent teaching in secondary school, the primary school teachers are not always equipped and language experts in their own field, and that needs support. And I think the Welsh government is pushing for support for these teachers. And also, you mentioned again the employability, but actually the idea is that to push languages beyond the traditional teaching and translation, because these are the two traditional ways that students will ask about when they are inquiring about language and what's in it for me at the end of this degree. And if you just present it, there's a presentation of it as being a translation and a teaching and career, and that's completely need re-tackling, specifically in AI now, because as we speak, a lot of organizations and international organizations on the continent are getting rid of translators and replacing them with AI. So that's a fact that is happening. The other thing also is that languages cost money to teach them, whether in school or in university. So there needs to be a lot of lobbying in terms of government lobbying to pour more money into this area of learning, because otherwise there won't be anything moving forward if there isn't money to back it up, whether small fundings. And it's always onerous upon us as teachers or educators or university lecturers to run around and try and find a bit of grant here and there and everywhere. And these things to do from below cost a lot of effort on our behalf and a lot of time consuming, which probably end up in also not getting the funding. So I hope I've covered everything that I wanted to say. Definitely collaborate. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you. We need to be, as you've said, and as Charles mentioned explicitly, we need to be continually feeding off what is happening in the different four nations, often at different speeds. We need to be really thinking about how the structures support that collaboration. And we need to be thinking beyond some of the traditional ways in which we have argued for the importance of languages, and really coming together and doing that and sharing and finding the fora with which to share ideas and practice is essential. Is there any last point that people want to make? I mean, I'm aware that I'm overburdening our speakers with responses, but just...
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on this. Yeah, I think, thanks so much to everyone who's raised these really interesting questions. It's really wonderful to hear about all these wonderful initiatives. I think, thank you especially to Charlotte. It's really amazing the work that you do. So I think, in terms of, I think this brings together a lot of different strands here about, how do we actually advocate for this on a practical level? How do we sort of promote our subject and safeguard and protect our departments? It's a very difficult question. I think, to me, I think what not the case of Nottingham has shown is that, what makes languages disciplines vulnerable in higher education, it's not that they're inherently somehow precarious or unaffordable. It's kind of decision making which is prioritizing perceived student demand, perceived students' attitudes about utility, quite a sort of short-term hypothetical type of thinking. And I think it means that linguists need to sort of come together and offer a very clear voice, I guess, and a very coordinated voice in advocating for national oversight, protect small but strategically important subjects. That coordinated approach really matters, with articulating, precisely what is the expertise, what are the opportunities that are going to be lost if, say, we were to lose the sole provider of a language in a region or the country as a whole. Being able to highlight this kind of equality aspect, the loss of regional cult spots, all of this, I think really matters here. And being able to explain both the academic value of our discipline and the research that we do, but also, the kind of value that languages departments and languages centres offer to the wider community. So I think it's, on some level, of course, this has to happen, advocating to universities and policymakers, but on some level, the way that universities work means that students and their parents are sort of customers, and we have to target them as well with messaging as well. And I think this is perhaps where the value of social media, student co-production might come in, sort of stressing the value that the studies that students are doing have for them. What are they doing? What are the variety of directions and perhaps unexpected career doors that are opened by this linguistic mindset? I'm thinking particularly of Zara Fahim's recent work on TikTok, promoting languages, actually fielding these negative comments about languages. So I think it has to go beyond sort of advocating just to policymakers, just to sort of executives in higher education. It really has to be sort of, targeting. I know it's overwhelming, as Charles said, with all of these different sort of groups that need to be addressed, but I think it really does have to be a very sort of widespread campaign of advocacy if we are to have traction.
Thank you. And to a degree, really thinking about, you mentioned, I think, the word rebranding and the way in which, or at least changing rapidly according to the developments that are occurring across the four nations, and making sure that we have the structures that are available to respond quickly and effectively to those. Emma, do you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for all of those excellent points. I think I probably just wanted to come back to something that Charlotte mentioned about the need to be proactive, really. And, I absolutely 100% agree with that. It's not just combating myths. We really just need to develop that positive narrative, which I think we are all trying to do in our separate areas. Nobody's going to come over the hill on a white charger. Somebody said that to me, I think, in reference possibly to the government. Having said that, it's clear that there is an awful lot of policy work going on across a range of government portfolios, not just the DfE. I think that's really important to acknowledge the work, particularly of our colleague Wendy Ayres-Bennett and Charles Forsdick, yourself, in that space, in that policy space, and the cross-government languages group, which is also doing a lot to help, and the APPG for modern languages as well. But the need for us to help ourselves. I'm thinking particularly of higher education here. We can't sit still. We can't, hope that senior management won't come and sort of salami slice our departments to death. We do need to think about how we can transform ourselves, make ourselves more sustainable. So I think that kind of conversation is really important to have as well at a national level.
Thank you, Emma. As you say, there is no deus ex machina. There is a lot that is beholden upon every element of the education system and the way in which they act together. Charles, some final reflections on the many points that people have raised.
Yeah, just to say, to acknowledge the brilliant discussions going on in the chat. I have not been able to keep on top of those, but she'll read those later. There are just a couple of issues there I wanted to pick up on. Simon Coffey's just mentioned the excellent work of the Coalition for Language Education, which brings in another dimension that came out in responses to the curriculum assessment review, and that is the way in which those of us interested in, for want of a better word, modern languages, could speak much more productively to those interested in English as an additional language and think holistically about language policy across the sector. But no, as Simon says, I would encourage people to look at the great work of the Coalition for Language Education. I've put a couple of links in the chat. I couldn't agree more about further education. We haven't talked about it. Further education is actually much more challenging, even more challenging than other parts of the educational sector at the moment. I put a link to a brilliant report that Ian Collin and colleagues produced for the British Academy on languages in further education a couple of years ago. Lots of work to still to be done there. I also looked at the comments around the spectrum of competence and the issue of setting goals too high. There's a very good article in a special collection of Languages, Society and Policy that John Warne, Chief Exec of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, wrote earlier in the year, precisely on, and it links into what I said about asset languages and a can-do approach, not putting people off by creating unrealistic benchmarks. And I couldn't agree more to the exchanges around curriculum for Wales. Probably worth saying, I'm actually speaking to you from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and I'm here for a day event on the possibility of a national language strategy in Scotland, which will build on another very interesting initiative, which is the 1+2 approach to languages in schools in Scotland. So lots of learning from across the four nations. 3 points, Charles, that I'd like to reinforce from the comments from the floor. Charlotte's idea that myth busting is all very well, but we need to put positive messages in place. Couldn't agree more. And I think that then allows us to pick up on the key point around employability and skills. There's a genuine opportunity cost at the moment, because we as a nation and society are not fully grasping the importance of languages in a number of those policy areas we've mentioned. And it seems really important for us to work with, for example, the Cross-Government Languages Group, to ensure that language skills are embedded in what is a rapidly evolving government agenda. But what we mustn't do is lose some of the, by emphasizing skills and employability, we mustn't lose some of the crucial parts of what we do in languages, because those of us who teach the integrated study of language and culture, either at A level or at university level, or including if you do it right at Key Stage 2, there's something about not just knowing languages, but knowing the world through languages. And we know that what attracts the attention of pupils and university students is what languages give you access to. Now, in the longer term, that might be a career and that might be to other benefits, but in the short term, it gives you access to literature, to film, to comics, to museums, to politics, to understanding a different society. And I think we need to try and emphasize both of those. Yes, we can talk to a skills agenda, but we at the same time need to maintain the richness, the cultural richness, the social richness of what we offer in our disciplinary space.
Absolutely. In a world of increasing AI, the skills of creativity, imagination, critical thinking are more important to employers than ever before. We need to make that case. We're going to have to end in just a couple of minutes. I'd like, first of all, to thank everyone for the comments that they've made, for the extremely rich conversation that there has been in the chat, to draw attention to the point that Nicola McClelland has made, and the solidarity that we all feel and the engagement that we feel with what is happening in Nottingham. On the subject of the way in which we engage with the whole of the educational sector, we will be organising our next session on languages for all. If people want to write to me personally about what they would like to see in this seminar series, then please do, and propose things that we can share and discuss. So I'd just like to thank Megan for her report, for the enormous traction that it has had and continues to have, the focus that it gives us, and to thank Megan, Emma, and Charles for speaking so engagingly and with such depth about all of these issues. The issue is not simply for us to talk, but to pursue, as Charlotte and many others have said, both in the chat and in the discussion, how we act on the basis of that and act collaboratively. So I'd like to thank our speakers, our audience, everyone who's contributed, everyone who's there, to thank Kathy for making all of this possible, and hope to see people again very soon. Thank you.